Welcome to the Mind and Body Understanding podcast, hosted by Jeff Pharion, brought to you by Pharion Counseling LLC, and presented by the Foolproof Entertainment Network. We are here, as always, with our host, Jeff Pharion. Jeff, how's it going?
Hey, Reg. I've been thinking about that intro ocean stuff, and maybe we can find some steel drums that are not that doesn't cost money to.
We can definitely find some royalty free. I just got to get you to understand how to use YouTube, Mr. Pharion.
Well, first I learned how to use a computer.
Well, that too.
I mean, my gosh. Well, it's another show, and I'm very happy and privileged again to have my supervisor, Molly Fields, with us. And she's going to talk today about suffering and pain. And we're all going to have just joy in that, of course. And to start that, I'm going to put Molly on the spot, and I'm going to ask her to tell us one interesting thing about her that might be unknown by some people. So, what do you got, Molly?
Well, since we're talking about suffering, I figure I'll tell you a couple stories from my younger years that it created some suffering. So I was a kid who really couldn't walk across the room without stumbling or saying something ridiculous because I had really severe ADD and no one knew it because it wasn't even a thing then. And so life was pretty much of a struggle when I was a kid. But in high school, there were a couple highlighted moments. One of them was when my guidance counselor told me that I was not college material. That was really helpful to my self-esteem. And
What did he tell you, to get an apron and get in the kitchen, or what did he do?
she basically
Or
said,
she.
like, you should look at the service industry or something like
Oh,
that.
my gosh.
And so at that point, I was definitely going to college.
No doubt.
There you go.
So, and then the other one was when I went to get my driver's license. I failed the test 3 times.
You too?
Not only did I fail it, you can't make this up. The second time, we got in the car, and he said, "Okay, back up. We're gonna go left." I backed up into a car.
Oh, no.
That's a good way to start.
I got in an accident before I even had received my driver's license. I mean, the horror.
Oh.
So, I mean, that's some suffering, right?
I tell you.
Yeah.
And you said earlier that you didn't know anything interesting about you. That's very interesting.
I had to go way back, though.
Just remind me not to get in the car with you.
Right. I'm better now.
Well, good. I think it's important to get to know your counselor. Maybe not to the level that Molly just shared, but at least to a level where you're comfortable with them. And I'm sure Molly shares interesting things about herself with her clients. It's how they start trusting you more and more. And when they get in the office and they're suffering and they have painful situations that they need to deal with, it's good to trust and know that your counselor has experienced things in her own life, his own life, that may be applicable. So when we're talking about suffering, Molly, I always take notes when we have our meetings weekly, Molly, and you said something last week that just rung with me through and through, and it's the idea that suffering is a foundation for growth. What about that?
Yeah, it shows us who we are, and it makes us hungry for something else, right? I mean, it's the great unveiling of our character, of the core of ourselves, of what we can and can't handle, of our identity, of everything.
But what does that really mean? I mean, why would I have to suffer to grow? I mean, why can't I just grow?
Well, because suffering is hard and challenging, and hard, challenging things are what creates the muscle. And we're not talking about just muscle like working out creates muscle, or playing football, since you are a coach, creates
Sure.
football, or creates stuff, but that we create emotional muscle or cognitive muscle when we suffer. It becomes a necessity, where lots of people can just kind of float through life. It's kind of just easy, and there's not much that's pushing up against them, and that's a problem. I actually think it's a blessing to have to suffer and to have to persevere, because it creates, I mean, the people who have done the most amazing things in the world almost always have really challenging stories that they've come out of because they're hungry and they're ready and they know who they are and they know what they can get through.
But you said something about cognitive growth. What's the difference between? I understand, like if I fail at a business or if I fail at in a game coaching the team, that we're going to try to make some changes that will make our team play better the next week, or I'll try to do things more efficiently or effectively when I run the next business that I have. But what's cognitive growth? How does that occur through suffering?
Well, that's where the counseling process is so critical because you're getting an education on yourself. You're getting an understanding on what the cognitive distortions. I know that's psychobabble. Cognitive distortions are just a fancy way of saying messed up thinking. But that's where you're getting an understanding of where things in your mind are messy. There's a messy. I talk a lot about the messy mind, and that we've got to order it. You've got to order your internal world, and so some of that is what I'm talking about when I say cognitive muscle.
Yeah, I do want to talk about messy mind. I do want to talk about that. You also think that suffering shows us what we're made of, and I agree with that completely. I mean, you can see that. I mean, I always go back to Michael Jordan with this one, right? Because he always claims he was cut in basketball, which is completely not true. He wasn't cut. He was just sent to the JV team as a sophomore or whatever. But to this day, that man has a vendetta against that situation with him because obviously he felt that was an injustice, a grand injustice that ruined him for whatever time period that occurred. That's kind of an eccentric example. Is there a better example we could talk about with suffering causing growth cognitively?
What do you mean by example?
Like a type of suffering that you've seen people bounce back from and learn.
Oh, like
and
depression,
change.
anxiety, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, but is that the suffering, or is the suffering coming from somewhere else?
Grief, like losing something.
All right, so
I was about to say grief seems to be the one that I see the most often. And Jeff, we've talked about this about players in the past. Like players that have lost someone close to them often have a vendetta against the world. And, sometimes that can manifest itself both in positive and negative ways. But I think that generally speaking, grief is it's a big one in terms of if you have been through a certain level of grief or loss in your life, like either you've learned to recover from that and have come out the other end stronger, or you recess into yourself. And
I kind of have an example of that for me.
Please.
I don't even think you know this about me, Jeff, but prior to 1994, I was probably the shyest kid in the world. I wouldn't speak to anybody. It was awful. Like I was very recessed to myself. And then I had a tragedy happen in 94. And when you get that, I guess you said messed up kind of jumbly in your head, did happen. But then all of a sudden there was this awakening that took place, and it was like, you know what? I have spent my whole life being quiet and humble and kind, and I'm done being quiet. I'm going to start talking to people. I'm going to start talking. I mean, I still live by the humble and kind because I do try my best at that. But I was shy, and because I've lost somebody so close to me, it made me kind of awaken and be like, you know what? I have a voice. Does that make sense? Like I empowered myself to go further.
Absolutely. This is our wise woman from the She Shed, by the way, Lisa. And are you speaking of losing your father, Lisa?
Yes, I am.
I had a feeling that that's what was going on there. And it sounds like you made your own decision. I don't know if you were in therapy or what was going on, but it sounds like you made your own decision to come out of your shell and get back into your living.
A lot of it is I don't want to regret unsaying things that I could have said, if that makes sense, because I didn't get to say goodbye. I didn't get to say anything like that. And I guess I'm like, I don't want to have that ever happen again to me. I don't want to go through life not saying I care for you or this hurts my feelings, even though I still get, trust me, I'm queen bee of suffering of situations, but at least I know I can live with, I spoke my word. Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense, and I'll jump in there too, just from you and I have a lot of that kind of shared experience there, Lisa. Like it was when I lost my dad that, the year or so after that was not great, but pretty much from that point after, I changed the environment I was in, switched schools, that kind of thing. It was, I was definitely a different being coming out of that, so I can understand and respect that journey.
We have a bit of the full gambit here in the room. Lisa and Mike lost their fathers at younger ages, and Molly and I lost our fathers as adults just a couple years ago. And it's still resonating with me, as I'm sure it is with her. Molly, the next item that we wanted to talk about, I think is very relevant to this discussion in that she likes to say, Molly, that we get to choose how we suffer, but just not why we suffer.
Right. We can't control the why, because things just happen, and some of them are inexplicable. I still struggle with why my dad, had to pass and all that, but we do get to choose how, and that is one of the things that I find to be a privilege in my own world, but then also in the counseling world, of being able to help people choose how they do that. And there's so many different interventions, ideas, kind of things that I do with people to help them choose the how. But the first thing I try to do is help them not be scared of it, to kind of stare it down, to lean into it, to not feel like it's going to break them. Because
I like that.
I was at the gym last week, and I kept telling the trainer that I was going to die, literally, and he kept saying, well, you would be the first person to die. And I'm like, well, that could happen. That could be a thing. I could be the first person to die. And I've had clients out in my office, they'll say, like, if I really let this grief or this ugly stuff that I feel happen, I'm going to be stuck in the fetal position, or I'm going to be stuck, I'm never going to stop crying, or I'm going to be stuck sucking my thumb, or whatever the things are that people do to grieve and to work through stuff. And I always say, well, you would be the first person for that to happen to, because we all get through, push all the way through it. And so giving people a sense that they can push through is pretty critical.
So what are some of the hows that you've suggested or worked through with clients?
Right. So I like to use this language of containers for pain.
Yeah.
That we need to have places to put it. And the more pain we have, or the more suffering or loss we have, the more containers we need. And that generally people don't have any containers. And sometimes when they do, they're leaky, or they don't work very well. And then that pain just oozes everywhere, and we've sort of become toxic inside of ourselves. Like the pain kind of toxicates everything. And so containers allow for places for someone to put their pain. It's like ordered pain. And there's natural ones, like God or the universe or whoever gave us some natural containers, like tears. Tears are natural containers for pain. They're a natural externalization. It's pain leaving the body. That's why when people are like, I'm sorry, I'm crying in my office, I'm like, no, cry, because it's like a detox. It's like you're taking that pain and you're leaving it. But the key is you have to think of it that way. And people don't always think of all of these things that are sort of natural and then unnatural as containers. And so I want to help people identify, where are your containers, and how do we create some if you don't have any, and how do we create better ones, leak-proof ones. And so there's lots of ways to do that, but that requires experimenting, like we talked about in the last session.
I was working with a client recently that is in tremendous pain, but he's under the stigma that he's a man and he's not allowed to show or express or give.
Jeff, I told you that in confidence.
That's not you, Mike. It's a different person, and I expressed to him, that the only way he's going to get through his grief is to express his pain. And I like the idea of the how, though. Like, I want to develop that even further. I mean, containers is one thing. So let's say that I'm grieving my father, all right, and I really need to get through this. What kind of a container are we talking about here? I mean, what is it? What are we talking about?
An example in my own life would, because I lost my dad, within the last couple of years, and is that when I go to the gym, I go to a hot gym. It's 108 degrees.
Hot yoga?
It's not exactly yoga, but it's just torture, honestly. And it's an hour of torture. It's a lot of planks and weightlifting and mountain climbers and burpees. It's horrible.
Sounds great.
Yeah, it sounds awful.
It's horribly wonderful. But while I'm there, because we're sweating so much and because it's so intense, it's dark and hot and like sweaty, I just think of it as like I'm sweating it all off. Like I'm sweating that grief out. I'm letting it go. It's right there on the mat. It's left on the mat. I'm rolling it up. Like I'm actually thinking, like, because I'm kind of like really visual, so I kind of think of things a lot visually. So like literally, if I could like kind of leave things certain places, but everybody's got to come up with their own thing. But like people ask me a lot as a therapist, how do you carry everybody's stuff? How do you not how does that not wreck you, right? And I say I have containers. I have places to put it. And so when I get done with the session and I close the file, because I still have old school files because I'm old school, I'll think of it as shutting their stuff in there. Like I just left it there. And sometimes it doesn't. It like sneaks out and like chases me. And then I'll like shut it. When I shut my office door, I shut it in the office. And then sometimes when I'm in the car, it's still lingering. It's still bothering me. Like if I heard about abuse or some kind of horrible, you just hear horrible stuff sometimes in counseling. But I'll like think about it on my way home, and I'll leave it in my car. And like there's ways to do it where it's like, okay, I'm getting farther and farther away from it. It's getting quieter and quieter.
Just leave it at the bottom of the bottle, man. Sorry.
I don't think that's the container for pain we're looking for.
We're talking about containers, and I look at it too. Like, it's some of that is learning how to compartmentalize your life, and I have this conversation with my wife quite frequently. Like, I think she is almost frustrated with me to the point of how much I compartmentalize my life. Like, I am able to completely shut off work when I leave work. I have gotten a lot better over the years at whatever happens on the football field stays on the football field. I used to take that stuff home with me big time, and now it's like, all right.
Well, it sucks, but you learn how to lose as much as you learn how to win.
Right.
And it's just the reality of sports. No one has 1,000%.
But that's an analogy for life too. You learn how to lose.
Sure.
Absolutely.
It's like you learn how to win and you learn how to lose.
It made me a very different person. And I used to talk about that with my team, and I don't think some of them understood it because their parents would come back and say, "You were talking to my son about learning how to be a better loser." And I was like, I don't want them to be a loser necessarily. I just want them to understand, appreciate, learn from, and grow from losing, because it's part of life. And if you think that your son's gonna go through his entire life and never lose again, then you're not a rational person. You're not thinking clearly. Molly, you also talk about, and you said this in our last episode, becoming an expert of yourself, an expert of oneself. Is this part of the growth from pain and suffering? How does it associate?
Well, I think sure that suffering and pain are going to give us data for being an expert on ourselves, right? It's going to give us more information. I just think it's all in the mix. But one of the things I was going to say about, I kind of want to go back for a minute to the containers and the suffering and all that kind of stuff, because some language I use that I find people find helpful is this idea of labeling it to disable it or naming it to tame it. Like the idea that if we can get it in front of us, if we get it out here, we've named it, then we can tame it. If we can talk about it, then it doesn't have as much power over us. And so that's why when people have trauma, they say you need to have debriefment right away after the trauma, because people need to get the story out in the world so that it doesn't kind of keep them sick. And so it's the same thing with some of this stuff. It's like we can get that messy mind going and be kind of disordered and feel like deconstructed in some ways, or like the snow globe effect, I call it, where it's like you're all shook up, But when we start really talking about it, when we can name the things, label the things, order the things.
Can you walk me through this a little bit better, Molly? Because I'm hearing you, and I get the idea. We got to name it. We got to label it to enable or to disable it, and all that stuff. Enable it, disable it.
Whatever.
It's both. How do I sit with a client and they're saying, I don't really know what's causing me all this grief? How do I get them to identify it?
Well, you can do that on an emotional front, where you can pull out, the emotional words and help them figure out where they are emotionally and if there are emotions that have covered it or clouded it, and then it maybe becomes clear when you strip that away. Or
So you're saying the emotional words, like you've given me a sheet of like labels for themselves.
Yeah.
So this is like self-identification.
Or yeah, emotion identification, like sad or embarrassed or ashamed or
Okay.
confused or frustrated, those kind of words.
Okay.
Because our emotions are distracting and
Mm-hmm.
are like kind of almost create a shadow over things. And so if we can get those out of the way, then we can get to now what's the real narrative. What's the story that happened?
If I didn't have such a tool, like if I was just sitting there and it was just me and the person, we had no worksheets, we had no anything, how could I get them to come to an identification of where the pain's coming from?
Well, they've got to tell you their story.
Okay. So it's the whole story. It's not like what are you thinking about or what's causing your negative thoughts, or there's no direct question or no
I
direct
think you need
like
the big. I mean, I guess it depends on where you're coming in with a client on this. If
Sure.
this is like, first session or a 15th session.
Right.
In the first session, it's the big story. It's it's the panoramic, right? All the way back and around and through. But in the 15th session, it might be this week's story.
Okay.
So it just depends on, where you're entering in. But you've got to get them to talk and get it out so that then you can kind of figure out in there where's the little gem that I need to kind of focus in on, or where's the stuff, because people can't see themselves accurately. I mean, we have distorted views on ourselves. We have a limited perspective. It's like the blind spot in the car where you can't see, so you kind of got to like turn. I mean, we have those in our own minds, and so the counseling process is to like take away the blind spot or to help remove it. So we're watching for that. We're watching to see where the blind spot is that they can't see.
But then becoming an expert of oneself, I would come to like me being the client, I would come to an understanding of my own grief and pain. In other words, why I feel this way. I would become more of a master of that. Because the more I understand about that, the better I can try to overcome it.
Yeah.
I mean, is that the philosophy?
So does that come back to the ability, one, to kind of name and identify the emotions, but two, to identify what those triggers are, whether they're environmental or relationship based or whatever?
I was trying to stay away from the T word, but yeah.
Why?
Sorry.
No, I mean, that's a good question. Why? Because I don't know. Is it too cliche? Is it too?
I think it gets used in a cliche way. It's funny, like the most that I see it these days is dieting apps, like doing Noom and doing some of those types of things, and they talk about your environmental triggers and your social triggers and blah blah blah, and that's more just in like how you consume food, right?
It's being used less now than gaslighting is being used.
Wow.
Now,
The overuse of gaslighting.
it's just, and I don't think anyone really truly understands what that means.
What that actually means? No, I agree.
I don't know if I want to dig that up right now, but that's
Another episode.
that's a complete. It's infuriating when people start using that, and it's
Yes.
like you have no idea how you're using that. You're not using it correctly. But triggering for me also is another word that triggering triggers me. I guess is a
I hear
good
what
way to
you're
put
saying.
it, because
Because it seems like everything gets treated as a trigger these days.
yeah, it's like it's like a trip wire instead of a trigger. It's like we're gonna start a whole cascade of like emotional downfall if I just mention the one thing that we can't mention. But as Molly says, we've got to label it to disable it. So where's the fine line? What do we do with that person? I mean, please help me get over that, please.
Can I ask a question or I guess make a
Yeah,
comment?
jump in.
Please, this is crazy right now. Go.
I, without going into great detail, but I'm in the middle of something very suffering right now. And I put it in that container and I'm like, oh, I'm good. And then suddenly that container pops open on me and I'm like, oh, no, I'm not good. Like I'm having a problem. And how do you teach people to keep a lid on that container?
I'm so glad you brought this up. I don't think you should keep a lid on it. I think you should take that lid off. I think it is fine to be a mess sometimes. I mean, the world is hard and there's a lot of darkness, and it is okay to acknowledge it and to like sit in it for a while. That's the one thing that I think is probably what people would say is one of the most helpful things about counseling is that we can stand to be in the dark with people. I would say that all the time. I sit in the dark with people. And no one wants to sit in the dark with each other because it's scary. We freak each other out, right? But counseling is a place where you're like, it's ordained. Like it's set apart to sit in the dark with each other. And
It's the purpose.
It is a divine experience to sit in the dark with people. So I don't want you to turn the light on. I want to sit in the dark with you. Edith Egger, who's an author that I really like, she wrote this quote, "Hope is not a distraction from the darkness. It's a confrontation with it." Let me say it again because I think it's a brilliant quote. Hope is not a distraction from the darkness. It's a confrontation with it. So, Lisa, I kind of think like we should sit in the dark.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that. It just, like I said, I have something very raw going on right now that makes me try to put them in compartments, and I totally get that.
I think
It
what
just
Lisa's saying is that she doesn't want the lid to come off halfway through a shift at work
exactly.
and not be able to finish the day.
But it won't come off at work if you have it come off with your therapist or with your friend or with your person, whoever your person is. If you are doing that work at a sort of an ordered time, then when you're at work, it's less likely to. I mean, I'm not saying that's foolproof, but it's going to be better.
Yeah, work keeps my mind off everything, and I when I sit down is the issue. So sitting down gives me too much time to think,
Yeah.
and that's when my container pops up.
Do you try writing stuff down, like having like I talk about a container of like a place to put it, like in your phone or in a notebook or something, where it's like, okay, I'm gonna get back to this later. I just had this crazy thought or this painful moment. I'm gonna write it down and then leave it there and then deal with it later.
Yeah, mine's more like, it's more not painful thoughts, it's more the hurt. Like somebody that, like, it's almost a scarring at this point that you try to get over. I don't know, I'm making it too much about me, but it's just, when you talk about criminal lies and everything else, I don't regret anything I've done. It's just the people that have done onto me, I can't. It's hard. You know what I mean? There's people out there struggling with how other people have impacted your life. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it sounds like you're struggling with forgiveness.
I want people to say sorry to me more than anything else, but no. And then you go and read things like what's popping in my head. 2 days ago, there was a thing that popped up on Facebook that says your brain forgives or has forgiven the issue in 4 to 6 months. And I'm like, is that possible? Because I don't forgive yet. Like, it says your brain lets it go.
Yeah.
Do you believe in that?
Well, don't take this the wrong way, Lisa, but the first mistake you're making is getting information from Facebook.
Well, I know that, but it's still stuck with me.
Well, I would say that if everybody got over things in 4 to 6 months, I wouldn't have a job.
Right.
Yeah, that's true. Very true.
Molly taught me another great technique, and I don't know if it's applicable here or not, Lisa, but I'm going to throw it out there anyways. Molly can tell me if I'm dead wrong or if she thinks I'm okay.
Oh, I'll tell you.
She taught me planned grief. And this isn't grief necessarily with you, but it's certainly anger. And I don't know if you can do planned anger or not.
Oh, I've had people do planned anger.
So what that scenario would be is, you know what you're mad about, you know what the situation is, and you even kind of know how you want to deal with it in some regard. And so you can, if you want, just say, all right, I'm going to deal with this every Tuesday from 4 to 6, or even make it shorter than that, 4 to 4:30. There's going to be 30 minutes where I'm actually going to face this and do something about it every week for a half an hour. But then at the end of that half an hour, you stop and you cut it off and you don't deal with it anymore. And,
close the container.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that way you're letting it out. You're dealing with it. You're getting in front of it and you're facing it, no matter what it is, who it is. And then at the end of that half an hour, you know you're not going to do that anymore. So when it pops in your mind, let's say when you sit down for a couple minutes, you can say, I'm going to get to that Tuesday at 4 o'clock. And you can move on. I don't know if that's applicable, Molly. I mean, that's...
You do listen to me.
I do listen to you.
It's so refreshing. Yeah, it's applicable. The other thing I would add to that is I always encourage people to plan their grief when they already are going to feel bad. So, like, if you feel bad in the morning, first thing in the morning, like sometimes I wake up and I think, I don't have a dad. I really want to call my dad first thing in the morning. So then I think, well, that's when I feel bad, then that's what I'm going to plan my grief for, is when it's already going to suck.
But I like the idea of knowing when it's over, too, and then shutting it down.
Yep. You got to have a shutdown. And it shouldn't be more than a half hour, because really our bodies and our minds, it's exhausting work. It's like you can only run so much. It's like you can only grieve so much, then you got to just stop.
Does that make any sense, Lisa?
Honestly, I think that is probably the most sense I've had in a long time. And I hope everybody out there that is listening kind of takes that and rewinds it and kind of re-listens to it again, because I've never thought about it that way. Like, it's almost empowering to me to think about it the way you guys just presented it in front of me. Does that, of dealing with something?
Well, just, one extra beer at Christmas when I come over again. We'll
okay. But I find that very, very helpful.
Good.
And I hope other people feel that helpful too, because it is, in my head, I'm like genius right now. Like, I'm blown over, like, let it come out once a week, let it out instead of like letting it come out every 2 weeks, or, when it wants to rear its ugly head, let it out. Hello. I never even thought about that.
Yeah.
It's wonderful in my mind.
Good.
Well, that's the brilliance of my supervisor.
I'm paying him to say that.
I'm going to have to remember that. Planned catharsis.
I mean, you can. I mean, it goes back to controlling oneself. It goes back to all the things we've talked about in both of these episodes, where you have to be in control of your thoughts and actions. And sometimes you feel completely out of control, as I think Lisa has expressed. And that's Molly's word for that is messy mind. That you don't really have any clarity of your life or your situation, and everything just seems all jumbled together. Molly, could you maybe go a little further about how suffering causes that messiness in your mind? The messy mind. Did you patent that, by the way? Do we have to copyright messy mind?
Yeah.
Copyright Molly Fields, LLC. Okay, done. Go ahead.
Well, it's like a shock. Any kind of loss or pain is a shock to the system. And whenever our system gets shocked, it's going to be, and I like to use the snow globe effect, it's going to like shake everything up in there, which is going to cause messiness. Anytime you shake something up, it's messy. And so then there's all these processes we want to get to order that internal world, to order that messy mind. And we were just talking about one with the set aside time for grief, but there's tons of them. And so but it's trauma. It's the shock and awe of unexpected loss, unexpected life situations that just causes a total shakeup.
I call mine a tornado. I'm standing in the middle of a tornado instead of like a messy mind. So I totally get where you're coming from.
But the thing that's so encouraging and great is that there's so many ways that we are in charge, and we can control it, and we can change it, and we can reconstruct it. And that's really exciting, because just as hard as things are, there's just as much hope on the other side of it.
I like your analogy, Lisa, with that in mind, actually, because just like the eye of the hurricane or the center of the tornado, like if you've seen movies where people go inside the tornado, right? And you look straight up, there's the sun, there's the sky, there's all the mess is going around you, not like through you. It's going around you. And so you have the ability to calm that down in your mind. And you have the ability to make yourself be in a better and safer place than your mind wants you to go. And it's just a matter of, I think it is a matter of opening that container and letting it out on trusted others. I would recommend a therapist, because I don't want you to put all this on my brother every single day.
No, I don't.
And I'm not accusing you of that. I'm just saying that it'd probably be best for everybody just to go to a person that is trained and understands how to deal with this stuff. And it makes life a lot simpler, as far as I know when I go to my counselor that I will be in a safe place and I can let it all hang out and I can give them the messiness that is causing my tornado.
Yes.
And even if we can't choose the situations or the life experiences we have, we can choose how we suffer. That's the critical thing. We may not be able to choose lots of changes in our actual life, because there are circumstances that we're stuck in, but we get to choose how we suffer.
Very true.
I'm not sure how I want to suffer right now. I think about life, and you're not going to escape suffering ever. Like, it's part of life. There's going to be death. There's going to be accidents. There's going to be missteps. There's going to be jobs lost. There's going to be all kinds of things. And then choosing how to go through that, that's a very important, critical aspect of your life and living. Most people don't even think about that. I mean, do you find people that are like always thinking about how they're choosing to suffer, Molly? I mean,
No, that's a weird therapy thing.
yeah, and it's good that we get to teach
But
them.
weird is good.
Weird is great. I bring the fun to dysfunctional.
That's
I
right.
like to say. Molly's favorite
Put the
words.
fun back in dysfunction.
Lisa, do you have anything else?
No, not really. Like I had something and it just left. So
I'm glad I'm not the only one that happens to.
Well, I'll give you
Okay.
Molly's number. You can call her and ask her later. It's all right.
I got several thoughts that have come and just left this hour.
Molly, do you have any final thoughts on what we discussed today?
No, I just think it's an important conversation. I'm glad we've had it, and
I think it is too, and knowing all the people I know in the world, I don't know a person on this planet who hasn't had a moment of grief, a moment of suffering, a moment of pain. I mean, it's just part of it, especially, going through sports and things like I have. And I think about the difference between the pain that I felt losing a football game as a head coach and then the pain that I see from clients that come in that have real pain, real issues, real pain. I'm glad that we have come up with some things here that might be able to help them. And that's all we got.
thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Molly.
thanks, Jeff.
Mike.
Thanks, Lise. Thanks, Mikey.
And with that, this has been the Mind and Body Understanding podcast, hosted by Jeff Pharion, brought to you by the Foolproof Entertainment Network and Pharion Counseling LLC. Check it out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all major providers. And thank you and have a good evening.
Never a dull moment.